We're in the Gospel of Mark, and we'll wrap up some of the things. We'll still have one more section on end-time events, but we're in Mark chapter 13. We finish up where we started off last week. Cut it a little short because of communion. And end-time events here in this chapter, again, speaking of the tribulation period, not the rapture of the church. I believe the rapture of the church has already happened. Then that 70th week of Daniel, which we've talked about, will take place, called the Great Tribulation Period. And actually divide that, as we see the Lord does, divide that time in the first 3.5 years are, there's some things going on, but the last 3.5 are terrible. Matter of fact, Jesus said it's the worst time that this earth will ever experience. And so it hasn't happened yet, but it will happen. And that's what he's going to tell us there as we go along. And so we start in verse 14. It says, so when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing where it ought not, let the reader understand, and let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. And we see at the middle of this time, we'll see standing in the holy place, the Antichrist in the person and of the figure of a great statue is going to be there. But it was a picture of something that happened in the past, and we won't turn back there, but in Daniel chapter 8, we see Daniel predicting all these things hundreds of years before they happened. Even the Messiah being cut off, or the crucifixion, right down to the day that he even rode in on that Sunday when everyone was hailing him, and then later saying when they crucified. But it was pictured by a guy named Antiochus Epiphanes IV, and he was a Syrian king, and he was not a nice man. And he wanted to stop all the Jewish worship. And he also set up a statue of Zeus in the temple. And he slaughtered a pig on the altar, desecrating the altar. And then so he believed in defeat, humiliation, and then they tried to assimilate people in to get them to worship their gods. Well, the Antichrist is going to set up a statue, and we're going to look at it in a minute. He's going to enable this statue to speak through the power of Satan and the false prophet are all involved in this, the unholy trinity. And and people will worship this figure, ultimately Satan, or they will perish. They will be killed. And you have to live at this time, have to take on the mark of the beast, 666, which Revelation said is the number of man. And you know God's number is what? 7. So you would have 7, 7, 7. So man always falls short of God in 6, 6, 6, the unholy numbers. And we've talked about that a little bit. People do all kinds of things to avoid that number. Christians do. And I have done the same thing, not that it really, that I'm concerned that I have a phone number that has 666 in it. I would change it, but it's not really that important. So, as we go along here, he says, so when you see this abomination, this figure, the Antichrist declaring worship unto himself, not to God, he said, flee. Get ready for the second half of the Great Tribulation when all hell's going to break loose. Otherwise, he's saying, you ain't seen nothing yet. We've seen some pretty atrocious things happen in wars during our time and our history, but nothing compared to what's going to happen during this time. Because you're going to have Satan releasing all kinds of demonic activity. Satan can do great signs and great wonders. And then you have God pouring out his wrath upon this earth to purify the nation of Israel. And like I said, from what I understand, probably 2/3 of the world's population that's left will be destroyed and killed during this time. It's going to be a terrible time. And that's what he goes on. He says, verse 15, let him who is on the housetop not go down to the house, nor enter to take anything out of his house. And let him who is in the field not go back to get his clothes. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. And pray that your flight may not be in winter. And here's that warning. For in those days there will be tribulation such as not been since the beginning of creation, which God created until this time, or nor ever shall be. So we haven't seen anything this horrific. Antiochus Epiphanes was nasty. He slaughtered millions of Jews. He did all these terrible things, but he ain't nothing compared to what the Antichrist is going to do. And Satan empowered. And I believe that during that time, of course, Satan is on a downward trend. You understand that one day he was kicked out of heaven, we would say. And one day he reigns in the heavenlies. And then one day he'll be kicked down to this earth. And then one day he'll be thrown into the pit. So whenever you follow Satan, guess what? You're on a downward trend. And even though Satan thinks he's having a heyday, just as he thought at the crucifixion, his day is coming. His day is coming. So God had decreed, and I want to make sure you understand this again. We looked at Revelation chapter 6, where it spoke of these things, the four horses. But we're speaking of the same time frame, and God fleshes that out in Revelation. One day it'll be fleshed out upon this earth. And we see him, verses 13 and 14, speaking of the Antichrist, setting up that. And I want you to look with me for a minute in Revelation 13. And it tells you a little bit about this abomination. Remember, Revelation chapter 1 was John saw a vision of Christ. Chapters 2 and 3, he saw a vision of the churches and the church age, 7 churches. And then we get the seven seals, the 7 trumpets, and then the 7 vials or bowls. And so that kind of takes you through the whole book. And in Revelation chapter 13, as we put our scriptures together, and we're going to go down here to verse 11. And then I saw another beast coming up out of the earth. The first beast is the Antichrist. The second beast is the false prophet. And that's who's getting ready here. It says, and he had 2 horns like a lamb and spoke like a dragon. So you see who's behind what he says? He's Satan's mouthpiece. And he exercised all the authority of the first beast in his presence. And remember, up to this time, the Antichrist is in rule, and then he is killed. And he is buried, and he's raised from the dead. Again, counterfeit of the Lord Jesus Christ. But and people are going to fall for all this stuff. And it says, and this false prophet is going to cause the earth and those who dwell in it to worship the first beast whose deadly wound was healed. And however that takes place. But look how he does it. He performs great signs, so that he even makes fire come down from heaven on the earth and the sight of men. You remember who did that in the Old Testament? Elijah did that. Remember, fire came down. And so these people are on the earth. The people that says on the earth, that's the unsaved. They're going to fall for all this, and they're going to worship Satan. You can see all that taking place, folks, as folks are worshiping evil, and they're worshiping things that are definitely anti-God. And he's going to do great signs, and he deceives those who dwell on the earth. Remember, Satan is the great deceiver. By those signs which he was granted to do in the sight of the beast, telling those who dwell on the earth to make an image to the beast who was wounded by the sword and lived. He was granted power to give breath to the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause as many as would not worship the image of the beast to be killed. So, going to set up that beast. It's going to be able to speak. And it looks like the beast is even going to be able to kill people if they don't worship. And he causes all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hand or on their foreheads, and that no one may buy or sell except one who has the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name. Here is wisdom. Let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. His number is 666. And that mark there means to be an imprint made by a stamp, like a brand on slaves or on animals. So it's going to be a visible mark on your right hand or on your forehead that you, and 666, whatever Satan uses. Who knows? It may be a barcode, right? That when you scan it, it comes up 666. I don't know, but we know that that's going to take place. And so that's that abomination that causes desolation taking there. And Paul writes about it in 2 Thessalonians. Turn back there for just a moment. Just putting some scriptures together for you. Hopefully you can see kind of what's going to take place during this time. Jesus has shared it with us so that we can know, because we can prepare, because we're seeing the precursors to these things now. Wars, rumors of wars, natural disasters. A lot of countries, there's a lot of sicknesses. And I think, COVID? It was kind of a tragedy, was not, for all around the world. And so we see those things happening. And so a precursor, it's going to get worse than that under these things. 2 Thessalonians, chapter 2, and verse 3 and 4 says, "Let no one deceive you by any means, for that day will not come unless the falling away comes first." Someone had tried to deceive the Thessalonian believers and writing letters that weren't true and teaching that wasn't true. Again, always remember, folks, know the truth, because otherwise you can be what? Deceived. And, that's what I understand, how they even do counterfeit people that catch counterfeit money. They make sure they know everything about what? The real thing. And then they can see it, they can feel it, all those kind of things. Make sure you know the truth so you're not deceived. And it says, falling away will come first. And I believe we're seeing the precursor of that. We're seeing the falling away of people that say they're believers. I believe they're not. They're falling away. We call that apostasy. We see people denouncing their faith. Lots of that. And we're seeing it's going to get even greater. Because remember, at this time, if you don't take the mark of the beast and you don't bow before him, then you're no longer part of society. And it says, and the man of sin is revealed, the son of perdition, or the son of lawlessness, who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God, or that is worshipped, so that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. So you see that taking place. This great abomination, the Antichrist, wants everyone to worship him, and he's claiming to be who? God. And Satan will do that. Do you not remember that let's jump up here we will skip those couple and go over to verse 9. The coming of the lawless one is accordance with the working of Satan, with all power, signs, and lying wonders. Again, you see that Satan is empowering the Antichrist and the false prophet to do all these things, and with all unrighteous deception among those who perish, because they did not receive the love of the truth, that they might be saved. Scary verse 11, and I've researched this time after time, and for this reason God will send them strong delusion that they should believe the lie. I believe, as many great scholars do, that those who hear the truth and reject it, that they'll believe the lie during the tribulation period. Now there are going to be thousands and multitudes saved during that time, beyond number, it says in Revelation. But those who heard the gospel and said, I don't want nothing to do with that, they're going to believe the lie. And they'll perish with Satan and those who do not know the Lord. He says, no matter where you're at, flee. We talked about that. Maybe to Petra, that long corridor leading into a protective area. And it says that many believe that during the second half, all the Jewish people that could will flee. Maybe believers along with them will flee to this place of protection. And it says in another part of the scriptures that Satan will even try to flood them out. He will send like a river right on in there, he diverts the river, trying to go in there and drowning them out. Because God's protecting them. Of course, God will protect them because it says God opens up the earth and the water gets sucked in. God protects his people, right? And I talked about that a little bit last time. You are protected. Nothing touches you except God allows that to happen. You know that? And so isn't that great? You know, even in the story of Job, remember, God kept on opening up the parameters. He said, but you can't take his life. Now, he did them with sores and with 3 great friends and things there, but God protected him. He will protect you. Your salvation is secure. Our destination is secure. And he says, flee there because it's going to get bad. That ought to motivate us, right? To share Christ with these folks. Because this is going to be a time, and you know the sad thing is it could be some of our family and our friends that are going to go through this horrific time and this terrible time. And it should motivate us to share the gospel with them. Remember, our job is to share the gospel. God's job is to get them saved, right? Just because you share the gospel with people doesn't mean they'll receive it. And sometimes you have to share it more than once. There's probably some in here that heard the truth more than once before they got saved. And so God's still in the business of saving people. Verse 20, and unless the Lord had shortened those days, no flesh would be saved. But for the elect's sake, whom he chose, did you know that he chose you? God chose you. Jesus said this, you didn't choose me. What? I chose you. You are God's elect. Now here it's talking about Israel, but you are God's elect. God chose you. Isn't that's pretty cool, isn't it? Out of all the people in the world, God chose me. And I said, why? I don't know. That's because he's God, he's gracious, he's loving, he's kind, and he's merciful, right? Because otherwise, he would have just stamped me out. But he didn't. He chose me. He chose you. He chose folks in Christ, and that's where we're at. And I'm glad. But it says these days are so bad that if God didn't intervene, guess what? All the planet would be lost. But God always has a chosen few. And God's going to choose some of those Israelites out, and guess what? They're going to go into the next phase called the millennial kingdom. The millennial kingdom where Christ will reign. Guess where Satan's at? He's in the pit. And I believe with him is all of his minions, all those evil angels, all those demons. For 1,000 years, Christ is going to reign. And we'll reign with him. And then all those who are still alive and are saved at that time will go into that kingdom. Some people will go into it with new bodies like us. And they will go in with new bodies. Daniel says there'll be a great resurrection. And there'll be new bodies going into this kingdom. But the only problem is these natural bodies will have what? Kids yet. And people will live a long time there. They go back to living like they did in the Old Testament. Long time it says. And remember, during this tribulation period, the animals will be eating grass and not flesh. I don't know if we're going to become vegetarians during that time or what. I don't know. But those things will be different during that 1,000 year. And Jesus will be reigning. But the sad part of this whole thing that shows you the condition of the unsaved heart, because so many people blame Satan for everything. Well, you have an own nature that really a lot of times is to blame for things. Now, Satan may feed that old nature. Don't get me wrong there. But your old nature likes to do things that are different than what God wants you to do. And during this time, it says that these people will be there in the millennial kingdom. You can read about that in Revelation chapter 19 and 20. This millennial kingdom, and in Isaiah, there's several places. And during this time, things will be different. But at the end of it, guess what? People will rise up against Christ. They can no longer say the government made me do it. They can't no longer say anybody made them do it, because they can't say Satan did it. They have no one to blame, and God will wipe them out miraculously. He will take them out. And then we see that's in the millennial kingdom at the end of it, and then he'll come in the great white throne judgment. All those who are saved will not be there. The unsaved will be there. And God will judge them according to their works. That's a scary, scary thing. Because I believe there's different degrees in hell. And those that are today proclaiming things and people are following them and it's not the truth, they will be in some of the deepest pits of hell. People claiming, if you follow me, you'll get to heaven. You follow my teaching, you'll get to heaven. We find out there's only one way to heaven, right? Jesus is clear. We talked with Mary Ann this morning. Jesus says there's no way. Paul said there's one mediator, one go-between. And that's what a priest is, and that's Jesus. And so, and we already know that as we'll look in the next section again next week, we see that there's false Christs coming. And I think there's false prophets out there today. They're standing in pulpits of great big churches and leading people straight to hell. Because why? Because people are ignorant of the truth. They're ignorant of the truth. They've fallen under the lies of the world and of Satan. And they believe somehow they'll go there. Or many people don't even believe there's a heaven. And a lot of people don't believe there's a hell. There's cults that teach there is no such thing. But Jesus said it clear, right? There's just as well as there's a heaven, there's a hell. And that's our destinations one day. And one day, God will close the books on hell. You know that? One day after the great white throne judgment, hell is all over with. There won't anybody be dying and going to hell after that. All saved people, what? Forever and ever and ever. And however it's going to be, a lot of guys, Dr. Jeffress and Dr. Jeremiah have been writing books about heaven. Billy Graham wrote a book about heaven. Because we really don't know much about heaven. We just know it's going to be great, right? It's going to be great when we get there. Don't let anybody fool you. Don't anybody rob you of that blessing of the hope of heaven. And of course, my always is my goal that no one sitting here would experience the opposite and end up in hell. And you can fool me. You can fool everybody here, but you can't fool the Lord, because He looks at your heart. He knows exactly where you're at. And we don't want to fall into deception of Satan, the Antichrist, and the false prophets. God said He'd rescue us from the wrath to come. We know that He's going to do that. And Jesus is our refuge to go there. Watch out, living a life for looking for signs and miracles. That's why Jesus said, and I've said it a couple times, Paul said, we live by faith, not by sight. Jesus is coming back in the air for us to this earth to deal with the nation of Israel. God's not done with Israel. He's not done with you. He's still working on me to make me the man I'm supposed to be. And He's working on us. The Lord is answering questions. He said, what is the sign of the end of the age? I believe this is the 70th week of Daniel, the tribulation period. The apex of that, the climax of that, is when the Antichrist demands all worship to be reflected to him, actually to Satan. And we see those things happening in the middle of Daniel's 70th week. And maybe if we get the time, we'll look at Daniel and get some of that background that we probably should have had up to this point. If you have questions, go to the Lord, ask Him. Get in the Word and ask Him. If you can't find Him on your own, get help from someone that's a reliable counselor or a pastor or a good Christian friend. Get those answers. Remember, worship belongs to the Lord. And people say, well, I don't worship other things. I say, yeah, we do. Yeah, we do. It's real easy, right? Next thing you know, whatever becomes a priority in your life besides the Lord demands your worship. And that's what happens sometimes. It's real easy to worship money and fame. And how many leaders have fell into that? How many presidents, how many vice presidents, how many governors how many judges have fell into that? They don't say, well, just fall down and worship me, but it's real close. Football, sports, all those kind of things become an object that we worship. You can even worship your own wife or your husband or your own family. Be careful who you put first in your life. Remember God's priority. And Satan wants your worship. He wants your worship. Don't bow down to the god of this age. We'll look at more questions. When will these happen, and what is the sign of your coming? What will be a sign that we know you're coming? And that's what he gives in the next few verses of his second coming, not the rapture, the second coming, right after the tribulation period, which he just shared with us, right? Both half, first half in chapter 13, 1 through 13, and then second half, 14 through 20. And then we're going to look at what it's going to be like when he comes the second time. You're going to be with him riding on a white stallion. Isn't that great? Even if you're not a horseback rider, you will be one day. The only thing nice about the Lord's horses, you can't fall off. Right? Isn't that great? Somehow you just can't fall off. And it's going to be, I don't know, it must be fast horses to get from heaven down here. There's a lot of things that I was never really big into horses as a kid. I was more into motorcycles. But we're going to be riding horses and we're coming back. So you be ready. Are you ready? Are you going to be on the horses? Are you going to be on the other end of the horses' activity? That's a really serious question to answer.